So hi, everybody, and welcome back to the NYU's Center for Soft Matter Research Soft Matter Seminar Series. So I'm really happy today to be able to introduce our speaker, Dan Goldman from Georgia Tech. Now, I first met Dan when he was giving one of these decadal reviews about what soft matter actually is. And he just presented a whole storm of different robots doing all sorts of other things, and it completely expanded my mind about what we even mean when we say matter. I mean, he has introduced the theme of robophysics into not just into soft matter, but into physics in general. And this is a huge and growing area of active matter, where the agents that are self-organizing have agency. And so this is, I think it's an important theme already. It's going to be an increasingly important theme. So Dan is the, he's the Dunn Family Professor of Physics at Georgia Tech. He got his PhD at Austin, working, I guess, with Harry Swinney.
Yes.
Then went on to a postdoc at Berkeley, joined Georgia Tech, I will say, not that long ago. And
nice.
And so he's associated not just with physics, but also with biology, which is, again, kind of remarkable, because the Department of Biology, because here we are talking about robots teaching us about how biology works. He's won all sorts of awards, like the NSF Career P-Case. I see a DARPA Young Faculty Award. He's also been a Burroughs Wellcome Career Award Fellow, and and his work spans a lot of different areas, from like real blue sky fundamental stuff to really like applied real world stuff that for example, DARPA and the Army care about. So I think all of those themes are going to get folded in for us today, and I can't wait to hear it. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Dan.
Wow, that's a wonderful introduction. Thank you, David. It reminds me of after, we had a much more eminent speaker come to visit Georgia Tech, whose name actually will appear in this talk. And in a lovely British accent, after an introduction, which was as glowing, he said, "Well, you've heard the hype, now here's the lope." So I'll do my best to live up to David's wonderful introduction. Yeah, I'm Dan Goldman. I'm at Georgia Tech, and like he says, I haven't been here for that long. I'm relatively new. And I'm going to tell you today about what I'm going to say is surprises in self-deforming, self-propelling systems. And I hope at least by the end of the talk, you'll have absorbed this, that the kind of things you see wiggling and squiggling around here are actually rather interesting systems to explore and learn some new physics and potentially new biology, and off we go. Okay, so basically, my group at Georgia Tech spends a lot of our time on trying to understand movement of living systems. Kind of the beating heart of my research program is trying to understand how living systems do what they do in natural environments. And of course, organisms excel at movement across scales, either an elephant or a crawling cell or a flying yellow jacket. Organisms move impressively in diverse environments. Most of what my group is focused on is what we call terrestrial locomotion, and that's locomotion on terra firma, which before I started in all this business was sort of thought to be kind of a backwater. The interesting problems were supposed to be in flying and swimming, because hard ground is nothing more than just paved roads for the most part, according to what folks have been thinking. Well, that's not true. And it turns out that the environments that organisms move around in can be quite complex. And the patterns by which they move so successfully in these complex environments, which we'll call patterns of self-deformation, which I'll amplify on as we move around, as we go through, can be quite interesting and complex too. And here's a video I like to start talks with. It's a video of a poor little lizard being chased. Movement is, when I first got into this business of movement of organisms, now, as David says, not so long ago, I basically the only thing I'd ever heard about movement was movement from basically ideas descended from this gentleman. And the reason I call this slide Demotu is because this gentleman wrote a book that was published after he died, De Motu Antiquaria. And of course, we in physics owe a lot to the insights of Galileo and subsequent followers. And Galileo was really interested in, of course, the movement of objects due to external forces, really the motion of heavenly bodies, let's say, like gravity, keeping an object in orbit. And as important is this idea that of inertia, that objects retain their velocity unless a force acts. So you keep going at your speed and orientation unless a force acts. That's called inertia, of course. A contemporary of Galileo, who I never heard of, but now am somewhat familiar with, is a guy who wrote a book, De Motu Animalium, a guy named Borelli. And Borelli was actually interested in movement, but of a very different sort. And this is movement of or from complex systems, where here now the motion of the center of mass is due to generation of internal forces. So the lizard you saw in the previous slide isn't moving across the environment because it's being pulled by a force. It's generating the shape changes in its body, which ultimately couple to the environment to propel itself. We're going to call this self-propulsion to distinguish it from movement of the inertial type of Galileo. And I guess now it's kind of funny, when I started this, as David says, not so long ago, this term, as far as I could tell, didn't exist. And now, of course, it's taken over. And I guess we could call this kind of putting the active into active matter. And I put matter in quotes here because I think that's an interesting philosophical discussion, whether you call a living system active matter. And we can have that discussion maybe afterwards. But nevertheless, most of human technology self-propels without much self-deformation. So whether you're a rocket expelling stuff out your back and by Newton's third, pushing yourself forward, or a submarine with propellers, a car with tires, I would say that we don't think of locomotion of our human-made devices as really occurring via large changes in shape. Now you might say, well, the tires change shape and roll, but that's not the kind of self-deformation I'm thinking about. Self-deformation is, of course, part and parcel of what folks are trying to use to propel robots in our world. And these are old videos at this point. There's a blooper reel from a DARPA robotics challenge in 2015, in which researchers spent millions of dollars trying to make humanoid-like robots that could exist and work in environments where humans would have a hard time working. And of course, this is funny because there's all sorts of amusing failures. Even the best humanoid-like robots today still don't possess the locomotor capabilities of a small child. And this is not because they have to balance themselves in their upright. Often, you have failures of actually relatively simple robots. There's a little cockroach-inspired robot out in the Mojave Desert, and here it suffers largely because it doesn't understand how to interact with soft material making up the sandy slopes and creosote bush. It turns out that these have extraterrestrial implications. Here is a famous video from a rover, which did not move for about a month because its self-deforming appendage, a wheel at the end of its limb, was kind of churning up granular material. And here is another example of the state-of-the-art best limbless robots, useful in principle for things like search and rescue and disaster sites and rubble piles, not succeeding at a sort of normal limbless locomotor task, moving through grass. So that's kind of a a sort of somewhat sorry state of affairs. And some part of this is that we don't understand principles of self-deformation, self-propulsion via self-deformation yet. But I just want to sort of set the stage for a little part of the talk that typically we also don't necessarily understand the soft materials for which terrestrial locomotors interact. It turns out, big surprise, the terrestrial environment is only hard and rigid and paved when humans go and pave it and make it hard and rigid. For the most part, locomotion in the natural world proceeds over kind of weird, complex terrain, which deforms and flows upon interaction, be it a lizard scuttling through leaf litter, a snake swerving through deserts filled with brush, or rabbits and foxes through snow, or my sort of favorite, systems like this sidewinder snake moving through granular material. And by the way, we've coined a term which we call, in analogy with aerodynamic and hydrodynamic interactions, pterodynamic interactions. And one of the goals is to try to understand interesting pterodynamic interactions which facilitate movement of organisms and robots. Okay, well, we've made some progress. Before I say we made progress, I don't really need to say this for most folks. Okay, well, we've made a lot of progress, I can say, understanding principles of movement, individual and I'll get to a minute, broad principles of movement of diverse organisms. We take what's called a comparative approach in biology and look for, and often carefully looking at one organism, but also kind of looking for principles across organisms. And here's just a repertoire of some of our characters we've studied, including sand swimming lizards, including sidewinding snakes, including slithering snakes, which can go basically 1 meter a second across desert sand, and even potentially cute little hatchling sea turtles on the beaches of coastal Georgia at night, who have to clamber down from eggs to the seashore to escape predation, in which they rarely do. It turns out, though, that understanding the emergent properties of animal self-propulsion and robot self-propulsion has been and remains a challenge. So why is this? Well, robots have been expensive, hard to make flexible, hard to add sensors, et cetera, et cetera. So this robot that you're looking up in the upper right is kind of a $100,000, I would say, robot integrated over a long time. And the animals that we study are often uncooperative. If you work with animals, you've experienced that. And more importantly, I think they're too good. This gliding of this snake, self-propulsion via self-deformation through the grass, looks almost effortless. And it's not until you actually try to build the dang thing that you realize how non-trivial it is. We're also, with organisms, typically limited in our capabilities to record muscle and neural activity, 3D kinematics, dynamics in natural environments. But I will say that, at least for me, in my group, there's been a revolution which has happened in the last 10 years. And that's the advent of low cost, turn out the sound, low cost, but powerful and smart and strong motors and controllers that one can chain together, coupled by 3D printed parts of which you can then make morphologies and shapes to your heart's desire. And one can generate these, as I call them, people in biology have called physical models, kind of a third component to theoretical computational modeling of living systems. I call these robo-physical to kind of distinguish that there's an active component to it. And this was made, by the way, this robot was made by a postdoc in my group who was a biology PhD and wanted to come to my group to learn some modeling. And there's nice advantages to the robo-physical modeling. If you don't know the equation of motion of your environment, then you're sort of, it's the only game in town to some extent. But it's become rather easy to make these things, and particularly at Georgia Tech, where I get infinite numbers of incredible undergraduates who've all done robotics in their high school, and I can just basically put them to work and turn them into my physics, physics engines here.
This is Alex. Can I ask a quick question?
Sure.
Why did these motors become available in the last 10 years? I mean, it seems like it shouldn't be hard technology. Is it like they're used for something these days, or?
Hobbyists, I think, have driven a lot of this stuff. I think RC car folks are, that my impression is, the RC car folks have, I think, driven a lot of this. But it's a great question as to what happened. 3D printers, I'd say, is the other real enabler. You know, I used to have to go to the machine shop to build things, and I don't like this. You'll see a bunch of our robots. I don't like the shape here. I don't like the shape that. I have to remachine it. It takes a month. Now you just print it and you get something new. And so I'd say the motors have been around for 15, 20 years. They've gotten much smarter. I'd say probably the electronics and microcontrollers have had something to do with that. These are called dynamixels. They're just one example. And they have all sorts of smarts inside them, as well as they interface nicely to Arduinos and other boards like this. So I don't know, it's an ecosystem which is sort of kind of emerged, and it makes life for me. It makes it so that, when roboticists come to my lab, they say, oh my God, you make better robots than we do, which is kind of funny. But I think there's a physics our robots don't go into the natural world for the most part, but they do what we want in the laboratory, which is the physics part. So to that end, you can see a sense, you can get a sense for the kind of diversity of robots we've made. These are already old. This is a sand swimming robot, and you can actually see through the x-rays its motors generating a wave of body bending down its back, which propels it through the granular material, little 6mm plastic spheres. Here's that same robot slithering on the surface, and there's really interesting physics and biology associated with not only how robots contend with materials that have memory, but actually animals too. It turns out the average snake you put on sand does not do very well. It takes some specialization to figure out how to move effectively on granular material, and it's largely combating these memory effects. We've also studied things. This is, you can sort of see here where we were sort of 10 years ago. This is a robot which is made, there's no 3D printed parts here. There's wood and balsa wood and aluminum, and it was hard to modify, and things have changed. We still get insight. Okay, well, I just want to say, and then I'm going to start the kind of the two main nuggets I wanted to talk about today. I just wanted to brag a little bit about that all this work over the last few years, okay, 10, 12, 14 years, has kind of, turns out, not been in vain, in the sense that we haven't just looked at one system and one system and one system. It turns out we've discovered general principles. And the general principle for self-propulsion via self-deformation in a homogeneous, highly damped environment is maximize your Berry geometric phase subject to constraints. And you'll now know that the British gentleman I spoke to who was giving a talk here is Sir Michael, who visited our lab, and he's playing with one of our robots. And it turns out that there's a beautiful story, which I do not have time to tell you. And we're only now starting to publish our main contributions on this, but it goes back to some insights that Wilczek and Shapir had in the 80s when they wrote this paper, Self-Propulsion at Low Reynolds Number, and then was sort of picked up and continued, not by physicists, but by control theorists, largely out of Caltech. Oops, I don't know why Marsden's name is missing here, Jerry Marsden and collaborators, among others. And these folks basically figured out that, turns out this is a gauge theory problem. And if you pick the right gauge, you can turn this stuff, which was good for what we'll say is infinitesimal self-deformations, into finite amplitude self-deformations. And you can do fun things. Oops, let me start this again. You could do fun things like figure out how to make a 3-link 2-motor Purcell swimmer move optimally in a granular material by enclosing the most surface integral in this abstract function called a height function, which is a function over 2 variables which make up alpha 1 and alpha 2, the arms of this guy. And if you're really excited, you can read the Marsden papers and some of this stuff, and you can learn about fiber bundles and connections and all the theoretical stuff, which I never learned anything about until I've had to worry about it. But it's evidently beautiful mathematics, and it turns out it's quite practical. And we've now applied this to diverse systems, including lizards swimming in sand, including mud skippers, including slithers, including even, and I put this in here, the turning of a little nematode worm. And one of the great miracles in all this is that the animals that we've studied, as I said before, are so highly damped that they're essentially, and if you take away anything from the first chunk of this talk, they're essentially acting like mimics of organisms at the microscale. So when you're seeing a lizard swimming through sand, or even a snake moving at a meter a second across sand, you're basically seeing a nematode mechanically. Its world is the world of Purcell's life at low Reynolds number. Just in this case, replace viscous fluid with frictional fluid, and you're done. And that's a cartoonish way of describing it, and I refer you to papers. But the coolest thing is that it's not just for granular materials, even highly frictional environments where footsteps generically slip at each interaction, like those encountered by myriapods, like centipedes, and now an incredible centipede robot made by a postdoc in my group, which is low cost, simple, but readily controlled. It turns out this geometric phase approach, once you pick the appropriate shape space, in this case it's a torus, and generate height functions, you can figure out the optimal coordination of body bending and limb propulsion. So it's quite powerful, and has even led to Yasmin, who's the postdoc, to take this robot and let it run around the grassy areas around our building, and it works quite well with no brains, basically. Okay, here's then the real surprises, I would say, in self-deforming, self-propelling systems that I'm going to talk about today. I'm going to talk about self-propulsion, heterogeneous environments, mechanical diffraction and slithering snake robots and snakes, collective self-propulsion, coordinated movement via uncoordinated dynamics, and task-oriented collectives. Okay. The first part of the talk has been led by these folks, including Fei-Fei Chen, who's now faculty at USC in mechanical engineering, Perrin Schiebel, who's now with Rob Wood as a postdoc at Harvard, Jennifer Reeser, who was a postdoc with me, is starting faculty at Emory in physics in 2021, and Professor Zeb Rockland, who is a brilliant theorist now at Georgia Tech, has helped out on some of the aspects of this and continues to. Okay, as well as a team of undergraduates without whom we would not have gotten any of the results. Okay, so terrestrial environments, as I think the point's made, are rarely homogeneous. Dry granular material is great. It occurs in deserts throughout the world, but those are, let's say, the exception. Most of the world looks kind of like this or like this, and even the human world. And I didn't realize this until recently when I heard a talk by the guy who's running the simulation team for the new Amazon Scout robots, which are purported to one day deliver your packages via little 6-wheel robots. It turns out the biggest problem that the Scout robots are having is that most sidewalks in our fair nation look not like the perfect pristine paved road, but basically have a lot of these interesting features. And it turns out that challenges these robots quite a bit. And so what they do is they use vision and avoid it. But I'd say that principles of heterogeneous pterodynamic self-propulsion are lacking. And so David commented on the fact that I was given at one point a DARPA grant. And that DARPA grant was in fact, and I have to thank Gil Bratt and Eric Krakow who supported this, was basically to try to bring a physicist's eye towards movement in heterogeneous environments. And of course, you know, I'm a physicist at core. And so the first thing I thought of was, geez, well, you know, I'll simplify the world so that it's basically some homogeneous environment and some heterogeneous environment. And I'll call the heterogeneous environment boulders and the homogeneous environment some kind of flowable sand. And if I could only understand how, if the boulders were far enough apart, how a robot scattered off a single boulder, then in principle, I could understand at least or compute dynamics of a robot or an ensemble of robots moving through such an environment and somehow potentially simplify my task for the roboticist's task for planning a mission. That was kind of the idea. And of course, it was inspired by, you know, the early ideas of transport of electrons in metallic bodies from Professor Lorentz. Well, I wouldn't say we got very far on that program, but we did learn some interesting things, including we created a device, which is what we call scatter, systematic creation of arbitrary terrain and test exploratory robots. And when I say we, it was Fei-Fei. This is a system which did something, as far as we could tell, was novel in robotics, in the sense is that instead of applying a learning algorithm to optimize the movement of a little-legged robot, we basically just performed systematic experiments over and over and over, varying parameters in the system. So in this case, it would be a jamming gripper, picks up a little sphere, picks up the robot, uses a fluidized bed to reset the state of the material. The robot then runs towards the object, and the vision system picks up the robot, and the whole thing repeats. And you can see what one experiment looks like. And here is the robot interacting with a spherical boulder, just a sphere. And you see something kind of cute where the robot looks like, we had expected when we started this, that a robot that hit a boulder would of course be repelled by the boulder. I should say that for the most part in robotics, folks tend to avoid heterogeneities because that could lead to damage of the robot. But here the robot is interacting, blindly interacting. There's no sensors. It's just playing its self-deformation pattern, which in this case is just its limbs circulating. And what emerges is that the robot isn't repelled away from the boulder. It looks like it's attracted to the boulder. Okay. And so you could do this over and over and over, automated, you know, Fei-Fei pushes a button and the experiment runs and she collects all this data. And you see a sort of interesting pattern where sometimes there's indeed repulsion, but more often in this case, there's attraction, seeming attraction. Okay. And it's not magic, of course, it's really a mixture of the torques from different limbs interacting with the environments, which lead to interesting turning. Okay. And of course, it turns out that we then, as physicists, sort of said, well, let's try other boulders. And the only boulders we could think of were 3D printed objects of different shape, mainly convex. And it turned out that this scattering was insensitive to that. And we even decided to be practical and useful, or Fei-Fei did, And that was to do something where if we know how we're going to scatter, depending on, it turned out that the story was that it really mattered whether you hit on the front side or the back side of the boulder. If you know how you're going to scatter, depending on when your leg hits, you can pre-correct the robot's trajectory before that disturbance gets into the system, in this case, using a tail to jam the material to kind of reorient yourself ahead of time. This is called anticipatory control. Okay. Well, Fei did some other things, like she put a sphere in the, and that was basically the same thing as her 3D printed sphere. She put a half cylinder and you kind of got some attraction. You know, the robot is here, here's a barrier, and the robot kind of appears beyond the barrier. She even put a full cylinder in, and this was kind of funny, that basically there was a hole burned in this distribution. The robot never went straight. It only went left or right. So that we found just kind of interesting. And it was kind of interesting until I was teaching classical mechanics to undergrads when I came across this phrase in Landau and Lifshitz, and I'd been telling my students over and over and over, the laws of conservation, momentum, and energy are really useful in scattering problems. And I'd been calling these things that we were studying scattering problems. I said, wait a minute, that's not right. We don't have energy nor momentum conservation. I mean, we do, but not anything useful. So what are we doing? Well, we're studying what I guess I could call active collisions. And I'm sure someone else has called them these things, but it's just what I could think of. And it turns out that active collisions, we're not the first, obviously, to study active collisions. Here are a few examples that I like a lot, including the pilot wave hydrodynamics, beautiful studies of Couder and then later Bohr and Bush, more and more, as well as biological scattering. Here's a clammy interacting with a hard surface. And even more either interesting or disgusting is cockroach-inspired robots and cockroaches moving through clutter. And the key here is, of course, that the activity in these systems leads to persistent dynamics, which actually leads to very interesting and novel mechanics. And that's the story. So this persistence is really the critical bit. Okay, well, I'd been interested in limbless locomotors, so I said, well, let's see what happens when limbless locomotors scatter. So we said, well, what's a limbless robot? Well, they're interesting as biological models. They're cool, potentially cool physics experiments. And if we could understand principles for limbless locomotors interacting with heterogeneous terrain, we might be able to make robots that don't require so many sensors and motors to perform the task. So this is a robot that was built by Jennifer and Perrin. And the robot is very simple in some sense. It has, I don't know, 12 segments here, each of those motors that I advertised earlier. And each of those motors is commanded to follow an angle as a function of time, and it's coupled to its nearest neighbor such that it ends up, the angle is sinusoidal as a function of time. The experts call these serpenoid waves. They generate waves, approximate waves of curvature, sinusoidal curvature that propagate down the body from head to tail. If you put this robot in a vacuum, it doesn't go anywhere, at least doesn't translate. So you need to couple it to the environment somehow. And the way we chose to couple to the environment was to use Lego wheels. And the frictional anisotropy in wheels coupling to the traveling wave leads to forward movement with very little slip. And if you're interested, it turns out that the same kind of schemes, which we call resistive force theory, which describes movement in sand and on frictional ground, actually describes the movement of this robot quite well once you know the so-called drag anisotropy function of a Lego wheel. And it turns out that it doesn't look like a viscous fluid, which would be the gray line here for the experts. It is a really sharply rising function, which anyway, that's a detail. Point is, you put a wave of self-deformation, which the only thing the controller is doing, which you can't see the controller here, is maintaining that shape as a function of time on the robot. And everything else is emergent once it couples to the environment. Okay, and you see a little heterogeneity here, but this is kind of what it looks like. Well, we decided, and this was the question, in this picture, the robot kind of looks wavy and it's localized. Will it scatter more like a wave or a particle? That was kind of the fun question we asked starting off. Well, we decided to do a careful experiment, and here is the experiment. We have overhead cameras, which can track markers on the robot. We have 5 posts. This is an array. Each actually can measure the force that's being applied to it. We're not going to talk about that here. And basically the experiment, again, the control is the robot doesn't sense anything. It just is doing it's just doing its self-deformation pattern, and its self-propulsion is all emergent. And so here's what the experiment looks like. You start the robot at some initial condition, and that initial condition can be varied by the experimenter. and you let the experiment go, and the robot collides with this array and squeezes through the posts, and sometimes scatters to the left. And I don't have a video of it, but sometimes scatters to the right, but I do have some data. And here is a track of the head of the robot as a function of space. And say from this initial condition, when the head is placed here, the robot scatters to the left, whereas from here, the robot scatters off to the right. And you can, of course, measure the angle of the scatter. Okay, well, we were having fun, and we said, this kind of looks like a diffraction, but it's not real diffraction. We'll call it mechanical diffraction. So I said, well, what do we know about diffraction? Well, what do we know about diffraction was what I had learned in, intro physics, is that if I have a wavy system, and I put a regular array in front of it, or some kind of obstacle with a hole in it, then the light doesn't necessarily like to pass through straight. It will get bent by some amount. And that's just via the properties of wave mechanics. If I have a regular array with spacing d, then everybody knows that d sine theta is proportional to lambda. And so I'll get maxima at these values. And so the distance from the center to the first maximum would scale like 1 over the spacing. As I try to squeeze that light more and more, we know the light responds by diffracting more and more strongly. Okay, well, let's see if we could see that in our robots. It turns out, just as a side note, since we don't have a wave of composed of many, many, many robots, we basically are in more of what I'll call the wavical diffraction mode. And the wavical was a term introduced by Eddington, which nobody seems to like or use. But this is the sort of fundamental idea in quantum mechanics, that you can perform single electron diffraction experiments over and over and over and over and over and over. And if you let it run long enough, you can build up a diffraction pattern, even though only one electron in principle is going through a grating at a time. And by the way, the first experiments on this were done by Taylor, who demonstrated this effect. And this is a paper called Interference Fringes with Feeble Light. And this is a great experiment because basically he put his light source, which was, I think, I don't remember what the light source was, but it was a very dark, he had opaque plates in front of it, and then had I guess a photographic emulsion plate downstream from the grating. And then he went away for 3 months. I think the claim is he went on a cruise and came back and there was a diffraction pattern. But if you look at this paper, there's no diffraction pattern published. And of course, people like Couder and Bush and Bohr and others have looked for sort of this wavical-like diffraction patterns in their pilot wave hydrodynamic systems. Okay, well, let's see what we get. Well, we have to vary our initial conditions. The system is purely deterministic, and it's not even very noisy. If we start the robot from the same initial condition, it does basically the same thing over and over. So we have to vary the initial condition. And so here was Perrin. We didn't have an automated system to pick up the robot and place it down and pick up the robot and place it down at the time. So she basically just manually picked up the robot and placed it down, and picked up the robot and placed it down over and over and over in this box of initial conditions. And if you record the position as a function of time and space for this robot, what you find is, and then build up the probability map. On the left is the head of the robot plotted, and the brighter the colors, the more likely it was to be in that spatial location. And on the right is basically the midline of the robot. What you see is that the robot either comes out straight or scatters off to the left or scatters off to the right with very little in between. And if you then plot, the angle, the distribution of the scattering angles, you see a kind of beautiful peaky distribution with a strong central peak and 2 side lobes. Okay, well, that's kind of cool. And I like it because it basically, I get to go and look at all the quotes from folks like Heisenberg. Both matter and radiation possess a remarkable duality of characters. They sometimes exhibit the properties of waves, other times of the particles. Now, it's obvious that a thing cannot be a form of wave motion and composed of particles at the same time. The two concepts are too different. He didn't know anything about active systems. And I think that's an interesting point. Okay, well, it turns out it's challenging to do many, many experiments. So one can go to computer simulation. And this is where this drag anisotropy function comes in. If one connects with some super simulators who do complex multi-body dynamics, one can create a kind of virtual scattering robot and couple it to its environment via this function that Jennifer measured, and then couple it to posts and make sure that you model the collisions well, and you can generate a computer simulation of the scattering. And it turns out that if you tune parameters right, then it not only does it match a particular trial, but it agrees over a wide range of conditions. So here are the scattering patterns of experiment simulation over a few different spacings between the posts. Okay, then this leads to a nice sort of experiment simulation study. And this is what I think is the first, for me, was the big surprise, that not only does this robot display a peaky kind of scattering pattern and simulation experiment, but suppose I take the spacing between the posts and I squeeze it down. As I go to infinite spacing of the posts, well, the robot never hits anything, and so the scattering goes to basically 0. This is plotting basically the width of this distribution that we measure at different spacings. And as I squeeze it down further and further, the simulation experimental data essentially are described by a curve that looks like 1 over d, where d is the spacing. And so what it says is that there's kind of an uncertainty principle. As I localize the robot more and more strongly to a transit through the post to a distance d, the distribution of its final lateral momentum increases like 1 over d. That's kind of cool. And then with the simulation, you can do weird stuff like make a long and skinny robot and look at how it scatters. And here, for example, is the robot going through a red post. Nothing very surprising there. If you look at another initial condition, the robot goes through and then collides and does a little bounce. And another initial condition, which has a very strong scatter, leads to kind of an interesting self-interference where the robot collides and then just emergently retransits through another set of posts. And in fact, there's some initial conditions you can get in this system where the robot basically behaves evanescently, where it just kind of will go along that lattice forever and ever and ever in the simulation. The basic physics of this is actually pretty interesting, and again relies on this idea of persistence of dynamics, such that, and I can give you the cartoon, that basically a robot encountering a single post will grind against that post until its head achieves a tangency condition, at which point it'll scatter off. And when it's grinding, because its shape is being controlled, as it's grinding against the environment, since its shape can't change from what we prescribe, the only thing that can happen is the entire body has to rotate. And so the longer it spends grinding, it turns, or colliding, the more it rotates. So there's a relationship between scattering angle and time of rotation. It turns out that certain spots on a peg, on a single peg, lead to longer collisions. Those are the large scatterers. That explains in some parts the single post distribution, which we see. And then the interference happens because there are a bunch of trajectories in this robot where the robot actually misses completely the post or grazes. And what happens is the other posts that are coming in, as we're decreasing the spacing between them, basically pick up that missed collision and reorient the robot. And that's kind of the important aspects of the collisional diffraction. But there's not a full theory of this. It'd be interesting to explore. Okay. This suggests a control strategy, which Jennifer implemented. And the control strategy is basically that if you sense with your head, there's a contact sensor, a cheap contact sensor. If you sense that you've collided with the post, modulate your amplitude depending on how long you think you're going to be in contact with the post. And it turns out that has the effect of, here's some videos. By the way, here's a gantry system, which we later built, which picks up the robot and puts it back down, not unlike our scatter system. That has the effect of, with so-called open loop, don't pay attention to your sensory information, you still see this peaky distribution. And when you close the loop with the controller, the peaks go away and the distribution narrows, and you basically have destroyed the diffraction pattern. And as an amusing aside, we decided to play the game of how best to destroy the diffraction pattern. They said, well, what happens if we try to observe the robot? So we introduced mobility in the post array, such that if I have a post array which is very heavy and able to move laterally in the environment, then the robot simply goes straight through. If the post array becomes a little less heavy, then you could see the robot collide and move it a little bit. And you could imagine observing the robot means that you are actually monitoring the location of the posts, not using the photons from your eye, somehow feeling the location of the posts. And if it is really light, then it collides and goes through and basically always just goes straight. And so you can plot the probability to find the robot at a particular angle post-collision. And when the array is heavy enough, you see two peaks, two side lobes. And as the array gets very light, these side lobes go away and you get just a central peak remaining. And you can plot then the distribution of final lateral peg array velocities. And you could see that in the very heavy case, the array doesn't move at all, whereas in the light case, the array moves quite a bit. And you can plot those against each other in some sense. And here's the mass of the array getting heavy over on to the right, and the sort of spread of the distribution on the y-axis. And you could see that as the array gets heavier, the distribution gets more spread, and in fact gets peaky, whereas your velocity of your ability to localize the robot it goes up, but your ability to know where its momentum is post-collision goes down. So it's kind of a measurement disjointed diffraction pattern. Okay. Turns out that you might say, what's this good for? We thought it was sort of beautiful dynamics and fun to think about, but of course it's not quantum mechanics. It turned out that this collisional diffraction, this mechanical diffraction, we were able to put to good use in living systems. It just so turns out that we were studying a little snake, which is kind of a robotic snake, which is called the Mojave shovel-nosed snake. Its natural environment is desert sand with sparse heterogeneities, meaning that most of its life, it's encountering dry sand and it's staying beneath the surface during the day, but at night it comes out to forage and it screams across the surface to forage, again, at a meter a second, basically, and on occasion encounters obstacles. And so it turns out we think that the basic control scheme in this, and this is what our geometric theory says, is the basic control scheme is play this wave. And if you do, you will propel yourself well on grinding material. And other waves will mess you up. And so there's a premium that kind of control, the neuromechanical controller in this organism has been tuned by evolution to basically be that. And unlike your garden variety, literally garden snakes, it doesn't change its shape in complicated ways to deal with terrain, okay? So it turned out that this led to a nice kind of lucky break in the sense that we could then send this, and they don't have very good vision either. We could send this snake through an array of posts. Here you see an array of posts, and we could do the same thing over and over and over, sample the distribution of scattering. First of all, we were interested to know that when this snake is moving fast, we think that the sensory information is being sort of damped down. And essentially it did scatter, sometimes not much, sometimes to the right, sometimes to the left. And if you then, after months and months of work and a bunch of undergrads chasing these snakes, if you plotted the distribution of where you found the snake's midline after sufficiently far away, you saw sort of a 5-peak distribution than in the far field, and closer to the array, it was more smushed out. So why is that interesting? Well, one, it's beautiful, I think, but two, it gave us an insight into actually what's going on in the snake's neuromechanical controller, its control scheme. Here are sort of typical collisions of this snake, and they look kind of gross. These are all slowed 10 times. Here the snake is colliding with a post, and you can see that basically the body buckles incredibly, and then that buckling is sort of propagated downstream. Here's another example. And here's the meanest example of where you just let the snake run into a wall, and it does that quite readily. And the system basically buckles strongly, and over some time scale, then it corrects for that buckling and then goes about doing something else. So this gave Perrin an interesting idea for a model. And the model is the following. We call it play and buckling motion. The idea is that the organism is basically playing this wave of motor, this motor pattern, oops, and, and that's what it's doing on short time scales. And it turns out that because the physiology of these snakes, unlike our robots, which are connected serially, where a motor is connected to a motor, the muscle and morphology of the muscles is such that muscles are arranged on either side of the spinal cord. And there's a pattern of shortening, of activation of muscles that goes from off to on to off to on down the body, and that travels. And it turns out that where, this was the hypothesis that it advanced in previous biological literature, where that muscle goes from on to off, grossly simplifying, you get sort of a preferred buckling point. And so the idea is that, and this is Perrin then put this geometric picture into a little model. And what you see is that this model recapitulates this kind of buckling. And even more interestingly, the model then with this basic buckling and maintaining this persistent wave generates this kind of pretty distribution. And here is the experiment. And here is the model, basically one fitting parameter, which is related to how bendy the snake is. And it does a pretty good job at least capturing the first 3 peaks of this distribution. And Zeb Rockland came and then helped us simplify this to kind of really the fundamental physics at play here. Okay, so I've now grossly overestimated my timing, and I've basically made it through 1/2 of my talk. And I can tell that this will be a long afternoon, so I'm happy to end it here. And next year come back and tell you about the collective aspects, or I could go on for a few minutes and and tell you a little bit more, but not take another hour. And we can upvote or downvote me.
Yeah, I'm encouraging people to do what Aditya just did and vote in the chat.
Oh, good idea, which I can't see.
You can see the chat.
Oh, now I could, except my window is,
Right.
I can't, anyway.
To tell you what, why don't you give us, just give us a taste of it.
Let me give you a taste.
No, nobody is saying no.
Okay. You're all very polite. Okay. Well, collective self-propulsion. I want to do this because I want to do 2 things. One, mainly I want to, promote these excellent people. But 2, I want to kind of just make a story. So we've been interested in active matter, I guess. But our active matter, again, from this biological point of view, we wanted to perform tasks. So here's some dry granular material that's performing a task. You might wonder where I got such material. Well, I got it from fiction. Here's the Sandman. And that Sandman is composed of lots of grains, and each of those grains has some smarts. And when they come together, they can do this, which is to form the Sandman out of nothing, or give him a hand, or whatever. And then the question is, what kind of macroscopic states and behaviors of a granular material can we achieve when the particles become smart? In robotics, how would one program such an ensemble of uncoordinated, distributed, stochastically interacting, minimally computing elements? And I put program here because I've recently hooked up, ooh, that's noisy. I've recently hooked up with some computer scientists who are obsessed by programming collectives of really dumb agents. This is Dana Randall at Georgia Tech and Andrea Riccia. And we had this idea, they had this idea for us to make little robots, which would be very simple. We call them Bob bots, buzzing, organizing, behaving robots. And the idea is inspired by provable transition in a lattice model, an equilibrium type lattice model, which is related to the Ising model, which they call the SOPS, self-organized propelling system model, to leverage phase changes to program minimally complex robot swarms to aggregate and perform tasks. Okay, well, here's what they look like when you put 30 of them in a room. They're not as numerous as the living crystals, but they're the best we could do. I should say that they each have, and you can see this in the DEM simulation, they each buzz around and vibrate on little bristles on their base. And they all have loose magnets arrayed at their periphery, 4 of them. And so we can swap the magnets in and out. If the magnets are weak enough, you get little transient clusters of robots, but they don't attach for long. And here's a computer simulation, a DEM simulation. But if you have sufficiently strong magnets, no surprise, they can cluster and in fact then form beautiful kind of living crystals, which have interesting dynamics in their own. And it turns out there's a transition. As I vary the magnet strength, the number of robots in a cluster doesn't go from 0 to max. It basically goes through this continuous curve. Experimental points are dark here in DEM simulation with tuned parameters is tuned once and then capturing everything, sails right through it. Okay. And so then it gave us an idea that in fact we could use this clustering to have these aggregates perform a task. So we throw an impurity, a non-robot, into the environment, and below the aggregation transition, they are banging around and colliding. But above the aggregation transition, look what happens. They form into a cluster, and then generically they expel the obstacle. We don't know how to control that, but they expel the impurity out of the system. And so this is basically leveraging the physics of phase changes to do something seemingly smart in a collective. This paper is in review. What I wanted to say that these robots originated in discussions at the Granular Gordon conference with Bulbul Chakraborty and some other folks. And we called them Bob bots because Bob Behringer had just passed away right before that conference. Most of you I know Bob Behringer. And we had gotten the idea that we would like to leverage stress chain dynamics in collectives of robots to perform tasks. And we've now actually done that. We've developed an algorithm such that our experimental robots can detect stress. And if they detect stress in a certain pattern, they can turn down their drive, and that can lead to more efficacious clustering. Anyway, so this was to honor Bob, and we still miss him in this community. That's one thing I want to say. The second thing I want to say, and again, I can do this in 5 minutes or so, is that those robots are relatively boring in the sense that this is what a lot of people have done, be they bristle bots. They don't change their shape. And I advertise in this talk that everything's about shape changing. So what do you get when you change shape? Well, my colleague David Hu, years back, has studied active granular material, which can change shape and then assemble and disassemble a pile of ants upon command. And we've studied kind of passive granular material, which has a fixed shape, in this case, U-shaped particles. And we found sort of an interesting fact that only a particular spacing, arm length to base width of the staples led to strong material properties, strong being that it was hard to shake the pile apart. This got us wondering, suppose I could take staples and make them modulatable, make the arm length modulatable on demand. Well, we weren't able to do that, but we were able to develop what we call smarticles, or smart active particles. And they're basically little Purcell-like robots, which have a microphone, so they have batteries, they have microphones, they don't have radios in them because we wanted them to keep their battery for long times. We can communicate them through them with sound, and that allows them to play different self-deformation patterns. In this case, a cyclic pattern, but we can do things like play a tone, and they can go to different fixed configurations. We can play a tone, and they can, if put on side, can crawl around a little bit. And we can play a tone if they're formed into experimentalists has carefully arranged them into a chain. We can play a tone, and we can watch that chain disassemble. All right. Well, let me just skip a bunch of this stuff, because it turns out that one of the interesting phenomena is that they indeed can crawl around. Oops. You can make them crawl around and track a light source if you give them a little vibratory motor, which helps them reorient. But it turns out that if they're moving around, individually tracking the light source, and one manages to, oops, let me get to here. One manages to get flipped over, whoop, it can no longer self-propel. It self-deforms, but can no longer self-propel. And we've been studying now this ensemble, this system now for a couple of years, where we have a bunch of agents who individually can't self-propel. They're active in that they can self-perform, but they can't translate in space. And it turns out that's a very rich system. As an example, one can't self-propel across the table, but if two manage to get near each other, they can hook up to form a dynamically bound pair, which we call physical gliders. And here's a video sped up 50 times. So this little bound pair is translating through the world, even though no individual component of it can translate. And this has led to all sorts of fun, which I'll just say, if you then enclose a bunch of those things and let them wiggle around, you find that while no individual can move, an enclosed ensemble can stochastically diffuse around. And in fact, it has no preferred direction, and the ring, which we call a super smarticle, anomalously diffuses. But we made a discovery, and this is the fun of playing with robots from a physicist's point of view, that one of the robots one day went dead, and we noticed that the ring started being biased towards the direction of that dead robot. And here's a more controlled version of that. You set the particle inactive so its arms are straight out, so it's no longer doing its self-deformation pattern, and it starts kicking around and just spontaneously sort of transports towards that inactive robot. And so we've gone to town with this, and Kurt Wiesenfeld, a former student of his, made a model, which is basically, we call the nudge model, which is basically counting up the various nudges that robots give to the ring and robots give to each other. And you can read the details in the paper. But basically, it predicts that for, depending on the ratio of the mass of the ring to the mass of the robot, you can either have the super smarticle go instantaneously towards the inactive robot or away. And then this setup, and I think I'll show 2 more videos and then one biological thing. This set up a very interesting experiment in which we figured we could direct the super smarticle with only light. So let me show you what I mean. Here we have a robot which responds to a light trigger by going inactive. And if it's occluded, I mean, there's a robot in the way, this one will go inactive and this one will remain active. And if I set that up and I have an experimenter carefully shining the light on the robot it wants to be the leader, then this thing can basically stochastically track towards a light source. But it gets cooler because we then set up a little algorithm and tune the system just right so that if a robot sees light at a certain brightness, it goes inactive. And what that leads is to an endogenous tracking of light gradient. And the cool thing is the robot decides which to inactivate. There's no centralized coordination. And you can see that because here is the color indicates which robot is inactive, 0 through 6. And you can see that there's an interesting pattern that this one was inactive and then it became active for a while and then it became inactive and active for a while. And so with no individual knowing what it's doing, basically it gets towards the source. Okay, and we think this is a theme, and it's a theme in which we've been playing with, and this is the gross movie that I show in the beginning, and I'll just show you a video of this. This is with Saad Bamla, who's an assistant professor at Georgia Tech in chemical engineering, and he got interested in entangling masses of worms. And here is a entangled mass, geometrically entangled mass of blackworms. And this, what Yasmin's holding, Yasmin's the one who did all the work on this, is a ball of 50,000 worms, which is basically feels like just like a bunch of like dough or something. And these balls have a lovely property that they help the worms, obviously, prevent them from desiccating. That was the first sort of obvious thing. But I'm going to skip that. But more interestingly, these blobs, because there's some value for the worms to be protected as a group. An individual worm can die on its own, but the blob helps with mechanical desiccation assaults, et cetera, et cetera. We did an experiment where we set up a container with a hot plate and a cool plate, and under relatively low light conditions, the worms somehow feel safe and escape the hot region by sometimes acting as a blob, but mainly just crawling rapidly away. But if you shine a bright light on them, for some reason, that scares them and they remain in the blob. And here's an absolutely extraordinary movie of here's a blob moving towards the light with we think no coordination of its internals. And then we worked out some of the mechanics of this, but as kind of our sort of final bit, we've even figured out some of the rules we think that enable a group of uncoordinated agents to entangle properly and have sufficient differentiation in how they self-deform to propel themselves across the environment. And so I'll let this little video play. This is Yasmin's video, and I have some conclusions, but I can just let this play and take any questions if you like.
So I think that was a call for clapping.
Sorry, that was a bit anticlimactic. I don't know quite how to end, but here's my conclusions. Geometric phase provides a principle for understanding self-propulsion via self-deformation, homogeneous environment, and diverse living and non-living macroscopic systems experience highly damped locomotor dynamics, and so in some sense mimic the micro world. Mechanical diffraction of slithering snake robots and snakes, persistent dynamics, and heterogeneous environments generate analogs and mimics of interesting physics. And this was a story which I didn't really tell you about coordinated movement via uncoordinated dynamics and task-oriented collectives. And appropriate differentiation of function and collective and mechanism to remain together leads to robust transport without central coordination. And I think that when you combine self-deformation, that kind of naturally leads to self-entanglement. And I think maintaining coherence of ensembles via entanglement is sort of an interesting thing to work on. Anyway, sorry I went long, and I'd be happy to chat and take any questions. And thanks for inviting me.
All right. Well, so this is totally open for questions. So feel free to unmute yourself. If you'd rather send a question in chat, we'll try to notice it. So take it away.
I'm trying to see the chat too.
And actually, I wanted to lead off, like your diffraction experiments, you showed experiments that had 3 peaks, sort of the principal peak going right, going left. But you also showed a hint of experimental data where you could have still higher order diffraction.
Yeah, so it has to do with, again, I just got some money actually to work on this stuff. Jennifer got tired of working on this and pushing the kind of crazier analogies. But so I'm looking for someone who would like to work on these things. And as far as I know, the longer and skinnier your locomotor and the more it's wiggling and bending, the more scattering you get. And in fact, there is even a relationship between the amplitude of your wave essentially sets the energy of your photon. So a more high in making the analogy, so that as I increase the amplitude for a given spacing, I scatter more strongly. So that's answer 1. How you get multiple higher peaks, it seems to me that just physically it traces through a bunch of the posts and then emerges. I don't know if that's an answer.
I think it actually is. And I think it's also related to a question that came in the chat from Raj, who asks, is there a way to control the flexibility of the robot? If yes, how does the flexibility affect the results?
Yeah, that's a great question. In fact, that was the first experiment I wanted to do, because I said to Fei when we first started this, I said, okay, what we're going to do is we're going to kind of do the Couder-like system, where basically you're going to have the robot, or the robot is going to be generating its wave, but its wave properties will be modified by the environment, a la the pilot wave, right? You have your object bouncing, it generates the waves. Those waves interact with an obstacle in the environment. They couple back, they change and so we would have the robot become flexible. It would generate waves upon its waves, and that would lead to interesting dynamics. And Fei said, no, let's just start with the rigidly controlled system. So there's no flexibility at all. And that led to some interesting stuff. I think it was interesting in part because, I'm getting to answer your question, in part because that's one kind of version of control. That's that you are controlling the shape of your organism or your robot. And so it doesn't deviate ever from that shape. Whereas the biological systems don't have that, in this case, don't have that control. They, in fact, are quite flexible and do deviate. But it turns out that, so then the mechanism by which the real snake diffracts and the robot snake diffracts are actually quite different. In the one case, the real robot, the robot diffracts, the rigidly controlled robot diffracts, as I said, its head is grinding against the post. Everything on its body is rigidly controlled. So the only thing it can do is the wheels have to slip against the ground and it rotates. The snake, actually, it's a buckling. And that buckling, the amount of buckling basically sets where it's going to go after. So I think that there's just really interesting things that one could work on with, where you have a really long, skinny kind of self-propelling, many waves on it, and you basically can get pulses of changes of wavelength that propagate down the body and then re-interact with things, if that makes any sense. I think that, so I don't know if I answered your question, but I think that it's
Yeah,
something I would like to work on.
yeah, I agree with you. But there is another question I am having, that you can also change the flexibility by changing the hinge angle. So now currently you can have a system, you can different robots with a different hinge angle.
Yes. Now, when you say
So-
hinge angle, do you mean the maximum range that
Yes.
Yeah, and we do that. In fact, I would just love to show you this. Let me just show you this because it's just too cool, and it's an example of. Oops, how do I end the show? Oh, my PowerPoint's crashed. Oh man, that's not good. Let me just show you this because this is an example of a robot that, you know, this is, for example, one of the, it's maybe an old talk or something. No, that's not it. Well, I was going to show you, well, this might work. I have an outstanding undergraduate who has built a more snake-like robot, which you can see. Oh, it's hard to see from this video. I think it's this one. Let's see if I can find it. It turns out that the flexibility, we can now start to play with this flexibility. This is so inspired by the basic, you know, musculoskeletal biology of the snakes. Marine has put together this robot, which basically has on one side little spools which wind and unwind Kevlar thread, and they go from on to off as it propagates down the body, and that leads to kind of preferred buckling points. And it also leads, she can change, you can sort of see it here, she can change how the amplitude, obviously, how much they're winding and unwinding, but also the physical parameters associated with how much the persistence length, basically, how much it can, and that is, you know, it turns out that one of the miracles of this thing is that here's a robot navigating through a lattice. I would say that this was inspired in some sense by Mike Shelley's work on nematodes in lattices. Here's the robot looking like it's finding its way through a lattice with only mechanics, only active mechanics playing. It even does a kind of spontaneous backup. And that's because of the interest. So I don't know if that was, again, an answer to your question, but it's just to kind of
Yes.
look at all the
Indeed.
crazy stuff.
Thank you.
Actually, this ties in great with Michael Wang's question in the chat, which is, can the snakes scatter backwards? It's sort of like the Rutherford question.
No, but here's the interesting thing. Snakes can't, but I bet you C. elegans can. We've been, because of this connection I told you about, the mimics of the microscopic and the macroscopic, we've now gone whole hog into using nematodes, C. elegans, which, you know, there's a gazillion tools at all scales to try to understand some basic locomotor questions. And one of the coolest things about nematodes is that they can play the wave forward and backwards in a way that I've never seen a vertebrate limbless locomotor do. So I don't know if they can scatter backwards, but they would be certainly the biological example. Oh, actually, I think I know what you mean. I'm sorry. When you said backwards, I interpreted backwards as the playing the wave backwards. You mean that the electron turns around. Yeah, no, we have, in certain situations, the answer is yes. But it has to hit a bunch of posts and things have to be just right. But we've seen it go backwards when going through a lattice, but it's rare. But again, that's an interesting question, whether if I set up the experiment properly, you know, maybe we have the raisin pudding right now, right? Maybe we need to make the, I will say that, since I'm saying it, that if I look at the single post scattering pattern, it turns out that we even get interesting near field effects. We get the sort of Talbot carpet, which those who are optics aficionados know about, this kind of periodic repeating, and David, I'm sure, has seen many a Talbot carpet, a periodic repeating imaging of the post downstream at integer wavelengths away from it. It's kind of pretty. We haven't published that.
So actually, so building on that and making it still sort of more active, Adam Lamson asks, have you looked at snake-snake scattering?
Oh, another actually interesting question. Excellent question. And in fact, shit, I don't have the video, but there's an awesome video somewhere. I wonder if I could find it. Coherence. There it's.
And now we have to bleep you.
Oh, sorry. Look at this video. This was, and I noticed this in this video. There's a snake laser, right? I have two, and it turns out that this phenomenon is actually been studied in nematodes. There's some beautiful papers. I can't remember the folks. I think there's a PNAS paper too, in which they studied, and actually a former student of mine, a guy named Nick Gravish, who worked on our staples and entangling, has been studying mechanical coherence and scattering in simple robot systems.
So have you actually run any of those experiments and looked at any of the actual, do you have any like preliminary results, I guess?
I do not, because I'm leaving that for Nick, because that's what he wants to work on. But I can tell you, okay, so this gets to a broader theme that I was gonna mention, that we haven't, again, I'll not answer your question by answering the question that I want to answer, which is an annoying thing. We haven't. You can look up those papers. Gravish is working on this. I will say that that there's a rather pretty set of phenomena which we think is quite interesting. That this is in collaboration with Jeremy England, who was at MIT and is now at GSK. And Jeremy has this kind of interesting framework he calls low rattling, which he claims is a predictive principle for self-organization active collectives. Is actually the title of the paper that's in revision. And here are kind of the fewest degrees of freedom which can demonstrate the basic principle of his theory, which essentially says if I have a bunch of active agents in the right, and I set things up in the right way, and that right way we don't know how broad it is, how generic it is, but and this is a little diagram we're supposed to show you, the dynamical configurations this thing locks into is much, much smaller than the full configuration space of everywhere that these robots could be, if that makes any sense. And what you see is manifest in these robot experiments, that 3 smarticles, which are started at random, they all have the same gait. They're all wiggling around with the same self-deformation pattern, tracing a square in their configuration space. They lock into these pretty little dances, which will just persist for long times. So if you look at this one, you can see that it kind of goes, they're slapping each other in some amusing, Larry, Moe, and Curly, you could call this one, right? Here, there's a weird kind of backwards, and there's about 6 of these. And so if you watch the dynamics are much simpler than we'd expected if you just throw 3 robots in. And it turns out that Jeremy and his student Pavel's theory even predicts sort of the probability to find these states. And so
That's
that,
so cool.
again, that wasn't an answer to your question at all. But but I will say that when coupled to the stuff we've been doing with the physical gliders, that these kind of synchronization and entrainment phenomena in these mechanically coupled systems are quite interesting and I guess common.
That's an awesome answer. Better than the question I asked. Thank you.
I doubt it.
Let's see, do other questions present themselves?
Can I ask about these entangled worms?
Please.
When they decide to disentangle, do you understand what they do? Do they start moving differently, or they change their surface or what they do?
I've been telling Saad, my collaborator, that to me, the miracle of these things is how well they both entangle and disentangle. Because having played around with entangling robots, and it's challenging to get these things to disentangle. And if anyone's played with, obviously I have a 7-year-old daughter, so getting things out of her hair, this disentangling problem is not easy. Now, these things they're lubricated with fluid, so that probably doesn't hurt. I don't know. Again, we don't have the only detailed mechanics studies we've got of these little things, and I blasted through this. But if I look at that video that I showed early on, and I heat up a side over here of a small number of worms, 20 worms, it basically looks like that the worms that are closest to the heat are kind of pulling, and the worms that are coldest are kind of lifting through no coordination, but that seems to have the effect that it propels them somewhat stochastically across. So they have the ability to change their function, of course, but how these things know how to remain entangled and then to disentangle is a very interesting question. And unfortunately, our imaging is not good enough to really be able to resolve individual worm dynamics. But Saad's been working with Arit Peleg, who's at Boulder, to do some computational modeling of this, and maybe they'll get to that.
Is it possible at least to see what happens on their surfaces in terms of some increased lubrication or something?
Lubrication, I don't know. Again, we have lots of data and lots of videos which look, I didn't show you any of this. And there's a French group, I think, that's been looking at the same system more from a rheological perspective. But you're exactly here. I'll increase this. I'll increase the size of this thing because it's really an extraordinary video that Yasmin took. If I were to watch this, this is sped up, of course. Yeah. So, okay, maybe in small enough groups, I'm just looking at the video, one could imagine imaging sufficiently to see how they're wiggling and bending. The problem is this is a naturally 3D phenomenon. And, the best thing we'll be able to do is to probably let them drink some iohexol and put them in our X-ray and see. But I don't know. I think that's where the role of modeling comes in. I will say that one of the things we learned from our robot experiments, which was kind of cool, is that we had this idea that you need kind of wigglers, and Yasmin made it so that those that see we substitute light for heat. So those that see the darkest light just basically wiggle, kind of like the coldest worms. And those that see the brightest light kind of crawl and pull. And that is not sufficient to keep the blob moving as a unit. It turns out you need a kind of intermediate state where the robots go inactive, but inactive with a short persistence length. If they are too stiff and inactive, that leads to dissolution of the blob. But if they're kind of floppy and go with the flow, that passively keeps the blob, the robot blob intact, and you get this nice self-propulsion of the collective. So I would imagine internally the worms are modulating it could be as simple as that they're modulating the persistence length, and that could lead to rapid entanglement or disentanglement. I will say that, now you got me thinking that the stuff we did with staples, and this was where our smarticles came in, we couldn't change arm lengths, we could change arm angles, is that slight changes in the geometry led to large changes in the rheology. And so I would imagine it would be interesting to know if the worms can stiffen or loosen just enough to make them resolvable.
Yeah, that's very possible. Yes.
So thank you very much, Dan. I think in light of like the time and everything, we should clap again. I will wind down the recording.